coming. I'm going to just talk a little bit about poverty, which is a pretty immense and broad topic. What we're going to talk about is how we can work towards a new conception of what development is around increasing opportunity. And really, what does poverty mean and how do we want to think about it? So I'm just going to go through in about 5 minutes, try and talk about a few things to do with poverty. So, gross domestic product per person, GDP per person. That's what we generally talk about. And in the US, it's about $46,000, and in Cuba, about $4,000 only. So about less than a tenth of the income GDP per person. So by looking at that, we can say that certainly the US is much richer than Cuba, and Cuba is pretty poor, only $4,000 per person per year. So we start to understand some of the contours of global poverty.
Are they both US dollars?
Those are both US dollars, yeah. Okay? Which is not that different from Australian now, but might have been a few years ago. But now if we look at it a little bit differently, we look at the country that's probably the poorest country in the world as of the data of a couple years ago in Burundi, in sub-Saharan Africa in the Great Lakes region, which has GDP per person of $119. So if you compare Burundi to Cuba, let alone to the US, huge disparities in income. And it's hard to find, that's considerably less than $1 a day. And the world definition of poverty, of extreme poverty, is $1 a day. So the average person in Burundi is earning about 30 cents per person per year. So is Cuba still poor? Well, not in this relationship. So what is gross domestic product? This is what we use in Australia when people talk about GDP growth this quarter was 0.2%, or our GDP has gone up by 3% or down by this or that. And we talk about recessions, that's about gross domestic product. So it's the total market value of goods and services produced within a country in a given time period, less the cost of those goods. It's about consumption, government purchases, production, investments, and so on. That's GDP, and that's income, that's growth, that's richness. So we look back at US and Cuba, and we say which of these countries is poor, and does GDP tell the whole story? If you look at life expectancy, which is a pretty good proxy measure for health, for example, and well-being, well, there doesn't seem to be a very strict correlation there between wealth and health, for example. So it starts to suggest that maybe GDP isn't telling us the whole story. And one thing, when we talk about GDP, and this is what all Australians talk about, the economy and growth and recessions and all that kind of stuff, GDP really fails to measure some of the things that are most important to us. So GDP forgets about traffic. So according to GDP, it would be great if everybody had 4 cars, because then we'd all be spending money on cars, we'd all be spending money on petrol, it'd be good for the economy. But GDP doesn't take into account the fact that you have to sit on the highway in traffic for an hour and a half a day to get into the city. Similarly, it would be great if we all just produced lots and lots of stuff. But GDP doesn't take into account the pollution from the cars or pollution from whatever else. So it's not really a perfect measure in that way. And lastly, if we think about obesity, who thinks obesity is a great thing? If you were an economist who were working on GDP, you would think obesity is amazing. Why is obesity amazing for GDP? Because people buy more food, they go to McDonald's more often and buy more Big Macs, so GDP goes up because people are buying more food. Then people get sick from being obese and they have to buy more health care. So there's more health care expenditure. That's great. They also then buy gym memberships and weight loss plans and Weight Watchers and things like that, and that's great for the economy. And then they die early, so you don't have to pay them ongoing pensions and things like that. So if you're an economist who's worried about GDP, obesity is fantastic. But what we start to realize is that this probably doesn't tell the whole story of how we want to value life and how we want to think about poverty. There's something missing here if all we focus on is GDP. So maybe we're not loving it all the time. So if GDP does not capture what we mean by development and progress, and it's missing out on some of these key things, then how can we perhaps understand what development means better? So maybe inequality, and I think this is one of the most fascinating slides I've ever seen that was produced not by me, but by other people. And what it says is that it's inequality, perhaps, that's incredibly important to well-being. And there's a whole bunch of slides from these guys. It's worth looking at if you have time. But this looks at the prevalence of mental illness. There's no correlation, there's no relationship between mental illness and income. But if you look at it by income inequality, there's a huge correlation. And what this suggests is that countries that are more equal have lower rates of mental illness. Countries that are more equal also have lower rates of obesity. They have better rates of child health. So it starts to suggest that maybe equality is a better measure of poverty or well-being than strictly looking at income. So we've seen the Human Development Index, which looks at life expectancy, adult literacy, education, and gross domestic product. And we see some countries are doing very well, including Australia, including New Zealand, and some countries not doing so well, Solomon Islands and so on, Vanuatu and so on. That's one way to look at it. Are there other ways to look at it? There's an index called the Happy Planet Index, which looks at ecological footprint, life satisfaction, and life expectancy. And then when we had Australia was number 2, now it's 139. USA was number 4, now it's 150. Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, some of these countries that were poorer in the other measure are now doing really well. So perhaps this starts to represent a different way, maybe a better way, maybe a worse way, it's up to you to try and think of it, way of measuring well-being and what poverty actually means. Would we say that the US is poor? Not conventionally, but according to this, it is pretty poor. So how can we start to decipher this? How do other countries or other communities define freedom from poverty or define development? Is it just income like we think about it here? Is it inequality perhaps? Is it about health? Is it about educational opportunities? Is it about freedom? Is it about happiness? And the opportunities that you guys have now is to go overseas and to actually speak to people in different countries, understand different conceptions of how to value society. We live in a very specific mindset here in Australia around money, good, everything else, who really cares? And that is a certain mindset, and that is a mindset that has validity, but does it tell the whole story? So in Bhutan, for example, they don't talk about gross national product. They talk about gross national happiness. Their strategy, their global, their national development strategy is about happiness, and that's what they measure. So gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. And that's the head of state, the king. So going to Bhutan and asking them, how do you think about poverty and happiness and well-being? Northeastern Kenya, I was working there for a few years, and this was a bunch of midwives and women in the community there. And they were poor by my definition, very poor. We started chatting, and I was asking them, how many children do you have? And the average number of children that they had was 8. I was like, wow, that must be a huge burden, you must be so poor. And they said to me, well, how many children do you have? And I said, I don't have any. And the look on their face, they were pitying me. They felt bad for me. According to these women, I was poor, and I was to be pitied because I didn't have children. I didn't have a support network. I didn't have a family. So I was there saying, oh, you guys are poor. How can we come and help you? And from our development mindset, we're going to come fix things for you. And they looked at me and said, no, you're the one who needs some fixing. We should find you a wife or something and help you out. And in South Sudan, for example, where armed conflict is health risk, which I've always just thought was a funny little poster there. But for them, well-being, development, poverty isn't necessarily about the things we talk about, whether you have a McDonald's or not, but it's about armed conflict. It's about independence. And South Sudan became an independent country in July of this year, after a referendum earlier in the year in January. So for them, poverty isn't about all these other things we talk about. It's about freedom. It's about opportunity. It's about independence, national identity, self-worth. So the Western model of development is but one way of understanding the world. And we need to travel and spend time overseas in different types of communities, not just going to London and New York and Sydney, but going beyond that to understand different ways of what it means to value societies. So it could be about stronger communities. This is in central Ghana, where it's about community engagement. It might be about environmental protection as a way of valuing community. And perhaps if you're in New Zealand, then you define success in a slightly different way. It's about rugby. And that maybe has value in and of itself as well. So take these opportunities, try and figure out how we think about success. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joel.